Hello, welcome to Inside Politics. No fluff, just facts. We dig into the power plays, the backroom deals, and the faces behind the curtain. I'm Anastasia Lavrina. Let's get started. The recent escalation between the United States and Iran has raised concerns about the potential for military confrontation. The US has adopted a strategy combining diplomatic overtures with economic pressure, exemplified by President Trump's letter to Iran's supreme leader advocating for zero uranium enrichment, while simultaneously renewing sanctions and targeting Iran-affiliated groups like Yemen's Houthis. Iran uses its nuclear program as both a deterrent and a significant bargaining tool on the international stage. Given recent regional challenges, Tehran perceives dismantling its nuclear infrastructure as detrimental to its national interests. Despite the heightened rhetoric, there are indications that both nations prefer to avoid direct military engagement. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has emphasized the importance of trust and respect in negotiations, suggesting a willingness to engage in balanced discussions. Similarly, Iran's foreign minister Kamal Khazari has expressed openness to indirect talks. Both countries are acutely aware of the significant costs associated with military conflict. For Iran, increased sanctions or military strikes could exacerbate economic instability and threaten domestic security. For the US, options include direct military intervention or accepting a nuclear-armed Iran, each carrying substantial strategic and political risks. Historically, US-Iran relations have oscillated between diplomacy and confrontation. While the current situation is fraught with challenges, the potential for a diplomatic resolution remains, contingent on mutual concessions and strategic dialogue. President Trump has stunned observers by claiming that the US will engage in direct nuclear talks with Iran this Saturday in Oman. But Tehran quickly hit back, calling the talks indirect and warning that the outcome depends entirely on Washington.
President Donald Trump made a surprise announcement on Monday, saying the United States and Iran were poised to begin direct talks on Tehran's nuclear program.
We're dealing with the Iranians. We have a very big meeting on Saturday, and we're dealing with them directly. You know, a lot of people say, oh, maybe you're going through surrogates or you're not dealing directly, you're dealing through other countries. No, we're dealing with them directly, and maybe a deal is going to be made. That would be great. It would be really great for Iran, I can tell you that.
However, after Trump spoke, Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi posted on X that the upcoming discussions in Oman would be indirect through a mediator. He said, quote, "It is as much an opportunity as it is a test. The ball is in America's court." In recent weeks, Trump has threatened to bomb Iran if they do not directly negotiate over their nuclear program. He gave a similar warning on Monday.
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran is going to be in great danger. And I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
Hours later, Iran's state media said the indirect talks would be led by Araghchi and US presidential envoy Steve Witkoff, with Oman's foreign minister acting as intermediary. Oman maintains good relations with the US and Iran, often acting as a channel for messages between the rival states. The US and Iran held indirect talks during former President Joe Biden's term, but made little progress. The last known direct negotiations between the two governments were under then-President Barack Obama. He spearheaded the 2015 international nuclear deal that Trump later abandoned. Warnings by Trump of military action against Iran have stirred up already high tension across the Middle East. Trump has also beefed up the US military presence in the region since taking office, but has said he would prefer a deal to armed confrontation. Iranian officials have said that Tehran would not be bullied into negotiations. Direct talks would not occur without the explicit approval of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. In February, he said negotiations with the US were, quote, not smart, wise, or honorable.
So joining me now to discuss this In more details is Alex Vatanka, an Iranian-born senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, specializing in Iranian foreign policy and regional security. So, formerly senior Middle East analyst at Jane's Intelligence Review, he advises U.S. defense institutions and is the author of several books on Iran's global role. Well, welcome to Inside Politics, and let me start with a question. Who stands to gain most economically or politically from a U.S.-Iran conflict?
Well, it's great to be with you, and that is a tough question to start off with. Let me just lay the landscape in terms of the Saturday talks that are expected. Look, United States has made it very clear. President Trump has made it clear he's not interested in a military confrontation with the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Iranians have made it very clear. They hope they don't see a military conflict with the Americans. They're saying they're ready for it, but really the consequences of conflict would be so grand on a scale that we haven't seen for a long time in the region. So for that reason, I don't think anybody really wants to see a conflict between U.S. and Iran. Now, in terms of who benefits from a war, obvious suspect that people might point to is the country of Israel. And they would, the suggestion that you often hear here in Washington and in the region is that, Israel has an interest in bringing the U.S. and Iran into a conflict and hoping that that conflict results in the fall of the Islamic Republic as a political system. I don't necessarily share that view. I clearly see that Israel regards the Islamic Republic of Iran as an existential threat. But I think the Israelis also are realistic in accepting the fact that the political reality here in Washington is there will be no major American involvement in Iran. If you want to go back 22 years ago where George Bush invaded Iraq, nothing like that's likely to happen with Iran now because there's no political support for it in this country. I think the Israelis know that. And I think fundamentally what Israel wants to see, and again, I have all the sympathy in the world for the Israeli position, is that Iranian nuclear program stays civilian, does not end up in a nuclear bomb in the hands of the Iranian regime, because if that was the case, that would obviously endanger Israel's security. So I think there's a lot of brinkmanship on both sides as we get ready for these talks on Saturday in Muscat, Oman. Both sides are going in heavy. They're speaking the language of, we're not going to compromise too much, but if there's a good deal to be had, we'll take it. And I think that's exactly what we wait and see. If this good deal can be achieved, I think, my final comment on this issue is the following. The agreement can be reached. President Trump has one red line: no Iranian nuclear weapon. Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has said a nuclear bomb is un-Islamic. It's not something Iran wants. In other words, the two actually seem to agree on that one issue. So let's see if they can figure it out in these talks in Muscat on starting Saturday.
So indeed, very interesting. But more in details, the regional actors like Israel or Saudi Arabia, do you still believe that they might influence Washington posture behind the scenes?
Of course they will. The question of whether countries out there in the region, U.S. partners like Israel, like Saudi Arabia, like the United Arab Emirates, like Qatar, and so on, of course they have a way of communicating their concerns, their interests to the United States. They're open channels. We constantly have visitors from the region. We just had Prime Minister Netanyahu here in Washington. We have the Saudi foreign minister here preparing for the visit by President Trump to the Gulf region soon. So these communications are happening. But communicating what these countries want from the United States really depends on what it is they're asking for. If they're asking for President Trump to go to war, if he doesn't have to, then the answer from this White House will be negative. President Trump is known throughout his political career of someone who has opposed what he calls stupid wars in the Middle East. So I don't think he takes it very lightly. And if partners, be it Netanyahu, be it the Saudis or anybody else, if they're asking him to do something against his wishes, he won't do it. But if they're trying to help him bring about a solution that works for the United States and might also work for them, then that is something this president will surely take seriously and try and work with.
Well, is Tehran genuinely pursuing nuclear deterrence, or is it a bargaining chip to ease the sanctions?
Look, in the history of mankind, no country has invested so much energy and money on one nuclear program. And people forget, this is a very old technology. This is about 80 years old technology. Iran could have had a nuclear weapon a long time ago, probably, if they wanted to. We've seen other countries do it. Pakistanis did it, and others have done it. So Iran has, to your point, probably in the last at least 20 years or so, decided to use the nuclear program more as a leverage and leverage stroke deterrence, as opposed to genuinely wanting to weaponize as soon as they could. I think most analysts would probably agree with me when I say if Iran really wanted to weaponize, it could have done what North Korea did 20 years ago. But Iran is not North Korea. Iran is not a country that can shut the door and ignore the rest of the region and the international community. It needs to trade. It needs to be part of the world. It has a very strong Iranian public opinion that hates to see the idea of Iran becoming North Korea. And for those reasons, I think basically what they're doing, you could argue that this is not the best, smartest way of doing it, but what they have done with the nuclear program is to use it as a bargaining chip. But the question really is, what is it Iran is trying to bargain for? And that's not very clear. It depends who you ask in Tehran. If you ask in Ali Khamenei, he will tell you something. If you ask the political sort of so-called moderates, they will tell you something else. There is no clarity on the part of the Iranians. Although, having said that, we're seeing more and more Iranian voices accepting the bottom line, that Iran cannot continue to live under sanctions forever. If they do, the regime's survival would be at risk. And that's a key reason why they're openly accepting, talking to, you mentioned Stephen Witkoff, a man who's close to President Trump. They're talking to Trump, a man who just a few years ago, Ali Khamenei said he would never negotiate with. And here we are, just a few days away from talks happening in Oman. It tells you what you need to know. Iran is not in a good place. They need to talk, and they're hoping they can reach a deal.
You previously stated also that United States of America are not interested to have a direct confrontation with Iran.
Yeah.
Therefore, could U.S. military buildup be more about signaling to alliances than preparing for direct action?
Absolutely. If you look back at the last 25 years or so, since 2002, when the Iranian nuclear program really first came to the world's attention in a public fashion, you've had many rounds of United States sending aircraft carriers or bombers to the region, threatening to bomb Iran. Iran, in turn, says, they will leave the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, or they will, build better and longer missiles and so on. So this is part of the sort of political posturing that these two countries had engaged in multiple rounds going back many years. That said, I also think if I was sitting in Tehran, I would pay attention to one simple reality. It is true that President Trump does not want to invade Iran. It is true he's not going to send 500,000 American troops to Tehran to occupy the country the way U.S. occupied Iraq. That's not going to happen. But that does not mean the United States does not consider the option of using the Air Force, the might of the American Air Force, to attack hundreds of sites across Iran if diplomacy fails. That is a real prospect. I think the Iranians take that very seriously. We're talking about the Iranian Foreign Minister, Abbas Araghchi, who just yesterday wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post here saying, we don't want war. We hope you don't want war. Let's sit down and talk. I think there's a genuine desire on both sides to see if they can figure things out. But final point on this. Look, U.S.-Iran relations have been bad about 50 years. It takes time to undo all this bad blood.
But is this brinkmanship more about domestic posturing, especially by Trump, than foreign policy substance? Because we do know that Donald Trump is usually preferred to act in accordance with a domestic interest to show its population that here's what Americans need.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Look, if there's one thing President Trump knows is that American people are sick and tired of wars around the world. They want to spend their money at home on basic things in terms of infrastructure and services for their families. So that's something that President Trump knows very well. He, in fact, got elected back first time around in 2016 on that very key message: no more stupid open-ended wars. And as we've seen on Ukraine as well, one of the first things he did was to pull the US back. He doesn't want to invest money in overseas open-ended projects that, frankly, from his point of view, do not seem to serve American interests. Now, again, you could debate that. There's a huge debate in the United States on whether that approach is right or wrong. But what I'm saying is, politically, from Trump's point of view, this is the right thing to do. So he doesn't want to do it. He knows the American public opinion doesn't want to have a war with Iran. But at the same time, he is under political pressure to do something on the Iran issue. So there are a lot of folks here in the United States, interest groups, that do care about it. Regardless of what the public opinion thinks about Iran, there are powerful interest groups in this country who do care about the issue of Iran. And that is why President Trump is trying and hoping he can solve this diplomatically and it doesn't become sort of a hole, a black hole that he falls into. That's the last thing he wants to see.
Coming back to the possible negotiations and the outcomes, could Oman's role as mediator signal new regional power dynamics in Middle East diplomacy?
One thing I say about Oman has a very long track record in working as an independent and respected mediator, going back 20 years plus. I mean, you can go back to the Iran-Iraq war when officials would meet in Muscat. So Oman has a long track history here. It's done this, they're respected, they're trusted. The issue of trust is really important. Other countries have offered their services: UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Iraq. But the Iranians trust Oman is the most in this case, and that's why these meetings are happening in Muscat. That doesn't necessarily mean there's a bigger dynamic happening in the region. I think the bigger dynamic has already happened for some time now. That dynamic started changing in 2019 with the Emiratis and the Saudis realizing that they didn't want to be in conflict with Iran. We saw them pull out of the war in Yemen. Basically, what you have in the region is a number of Arab countries in the Gulf, particularly the Saudis, the Emiratis. They are focused on economic development. And they realize they cannot afford to sit next to an Iran that throws rocks and missiles and drones at them, because that undermines economic confidence and undermines their plans. So I think there is a regional shift away from confronting Iran, certainly in the part of the Gulf states, and trying to coexist with Iran. And that's why they're so careful in what they say, and they're so worried about potential of war, because they consider themselves frontline states. Right? If Iran and the United States end up in a military conflict, you just have to take the words of the Iranian general from the Revolutionary Guards, who just said about a week ago that there are 50,000 American troops in 10 bases that we will target. Guess where those bases are located? They're mostly located in the Gulf countries. That's not a good place for them to be. So they're trying to also do their part to make what contribution they can make to get America and Iran to reach a deal. And we all have to hope that Israel also gets what it wants. And again, those of us who hope diplomacy will work are looking at these factors and seeing if a deal will be possible.
We cannot ignore the fact that Iran has quite stable relations with Russia and China, which is not in favor of the United States of America, and which have been criticized many times, blaming Iran for helping Russia to bypass the sanctions. So what impact might a failed negotiation have on Iran's relationship with Russia and China?
Look, the simple reality for Iran is this: if there's war between Iran and the United States of America, very few Iranians, certainly very few Iranian officials, expect Russia to come to their aid or China could come to their aid. I know we oftentimes sort of look at what Iran and Russia and China are doing together, you know, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the BRICS block of countries coming together and so on. And Iran next month is going to join the Eurasian Economic Union. All this suggests to us, oh my God, closer relations between Iran, Russia, and China. Therefore, they will come to Iran's aid. Not so. That is not going to happen. The Russians, in fact, yesterday said that if there is war between Iran and the United States, Russia probably will not play a role. This is the hard reality that the Iranian regime faces. It's strategically alone. It needs to put its own national interests first. And if it does so, I think the United States wants to work with Iran because it's not in the American interest to see a weak Iran that is a servant of the Russians and the Chinese. That's not an American interest. So you have both countries here, if they come together, reasons for diplomacy to work and reason really to move forward and start a brand new chapter in relations between Tehran and Washington.
A couple of months ago, there was an agreement signed between Iran and Russia about strategic cooperation, and I do remember how experts were wondering if there is something similar to Article number 5 from NATO, like if there is any kind of attack against one of the countries, another will respond or not, and there was nothing similar to what some experts were expecting to see there. That's why I can understand what you're talking about. And again, coming back to the possible direct talks between Iran and the United States of America, is Trump's rhetoric a negotiating tactic, or could it risk provoking an unintended military response?
Well, that's the danger. That's the danger, because you have two leaders here in this competition. You have Donald Trump, you got Ali Khamenei. Both of them are very set in their ways. Both of them think that they are right and the other side is entirely wrong. Both of them are extremely fearful of being humiliated in public. You know, why are the Iranians refusing to sit down with the Americans directly? Because direct negotiations means you got the cameras in the room, you have the public handshake, and if nothing comes out of those talks, for Iran's perspective, if you look at it in the political, cultural context of the Islamic Republic, that can be seen as humiliation. That's why they're so worried about not talking directly till there is something substantive that, you know, they think they can get out of these talks. So yes, the personalities matter. And I think, you know, there's a real problem here. President Trump likes a good TV show. He wants to show up and say, I got Ali Khamenei to come and meet me. I'm going to Tehran, or he's coming to Washington. Let the cameras roll. I'm the big peacemaker. This is what he likes to do, because he's essentially at heart not a political strategist. He doesn't have a grand strategy. He wants to be seen like a winner. Khamenei, this 86-year-old cleric who's an Ayatollah and has to, you know, be much different in his actions politically. He's not going to welcome Donald Trump in Tehran, because he's invested his entire political career attacking America, and particularly Trump, in the last few years. But that doesn't mean the two sides cannot reach a deal, because again, it's a basic cost-benefit analysis. The cost of a war between US and Iran are greater for both of them than the potential benefits. They're not going to fall in love with one another. Nobody expects that.
Well, let me ask
but you don't have to fall in love
one
to
more
prevent
question
war.
Before we conclude our dialogue. Could back-channel diplomacy be more effective than high-profile talks with this procedure in resolving the standoff?
No, I think at this point we need to move beyond back-channel diplomacy. You know, there's been back-channel diplomacy for a long time. The Biden administration did back-channel diplomacy for 4 years. It didn't go anywhere. It's really important to come out in the open, stand in the sunlight, and accept that there are problems here that need to be solved, and both countries could potentially benefit to have those talks and, you know, hope for the best. I don't know what the outcome will. President Trump doesn't know, Ali Khamenei doesn't know, but the stakes are too high. It's worth trying, at least see if the talks will produce something fruitful.
Well, Mr. Vatanka, thank you so much for joining Inside Politics today.
Pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much. Well, whether it's diplomacy or a show of dominance, one thing is clear. The United States-Iran standoff is entering a volatile new phase. With missiles, mediators and mistrust in the mix, Saturday could shape the region's future. Thanks for watching Inside Politics, and see you next time.